He stood silent outside Buckingham Palace, scars curling across half his face like melted glass. Tourists pointed. A few laughed. One even called him the cursed one. Christ, did someone forget to iron his face? The laughter that followed cut through the morning air like broken glass. And when the guardsman shifted his rifle, his sleeve pulled back, just enough for a veteran in the crowd to see the unique tattoo on his wrist. And then everything stopped. Because that wasn't just any ink. It was the mark of a unit that wasn't supposed to survive. And the man they mocked was the one who did. Want to know what happened when the truth came out in front of everyone? Hit subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Let's begin. The October morning hung over London like wet wool, all grey skies and dampness that settled in your bones. Wellington Barracks hummed with quiet efficiency, boots on cobblestone, muffled voices from the guardroom, the distant rattle of ceremonial equipment. Inside the changing room, guardsman Nathaniel Harrow pulled his red tunic straight for the third time, muscle memory from 2 decades of precision. The mirror showed what it always showed, a man divided. The left side of his face could have belonged to any soldier. The right side told a different story entirely. The scars started below his right eye and tracked down across his cheek and neck like a map of hell. Burn trauma, healed but never hidden. The kind of damage that made children stare and adults look away. Twisted skin, pulled tight in places. A patchwork of survival he'd worn for 15 years, 36 years old, though the scarring made it impossible to guess. Most people looked away when they saw Harrow. Some stared. A few, usually other veterans, looked with recognition. Today, pulling on his white gloves with practiced precision, he wasn't thinking about any of it. He was thinking about post-change, about standing still for 2 hours, about the simple clarity of a job that asked nothing from him except presence. The routine was automatic, tunic buttoned precisely, belt adjusted, gloves pulled smooth. The bearskin positioned just so, each movement deliberate. Meditative, the armour of ceremony that transformed scarred men into symbols. The sleeve of his tunic caught slightly on his gloved wrist as he made the final adjustments. For just a moment, black ink showed through the white cotton, angular numbers, and a symbol that looked more like a military designation than decorative art. Then the glove settled properly, and it disappeared again beneath layers of wool and tradition. The walk from Wellington Barracks was always the same. Cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of boots, the gradual increase in tourist chatter as they approached Birdcage Walk. Outside, the early crowd was gathering. October brought different tourists, fewer families, more pensioners with cameras, students with backpacks. The Queen's Guard took their positions with mechanical precision, each man knowing his post, his timing, his role in a ceremony that stretched back generations. Harrow took his position beside the sentry box, boots settling into the familiar stance, rifle butt grounded beside his right foot. The routine was automatic now. Shoulders back, eyes forward, breathing steady and controlled. The scarred side of his face was visible to the crowd, unavoidable in the grey morning light. 20 years of service had taught him to stare through people rather than at them, to find a point in the middle distance and hold it regardless of what happened in front of him. The first tourists began to gather, drawn by the spectacle of men in red standing perfectly still. Cameras appeared, phones were lifted. The usual dance of modern tourism began, with visitors trying to get the perfect shot while respecting the rope barriers that kept them at a safe distance. That's when the comments started. 2 tourists, maybe 22 or 23, stood against the rope barrier with coffee cups steaming. University students, expensive coats, confident voices, casual entitlement. The boy, Callum, nudged his girlfriend and nodded toward Harrow. "Bloody hell," he said. "Look at that one's face, like he stuck it in a chip fryer." Girl Rosie giggled and pulled out her phone. God, that's awful. Don't they have standards? Maybe he's why they wear those big hats, Callum said, grinning. Hide the damaged goods. A few tourists glanced over. An elderly couple looked uncomfortable and moved away. A mother quietly steered her daughter elsewhere, but others smiled, drawn into the casual cruelty. Harrow didn't move, didn't blink. The muscles in his jaw might have tightened slightly, but from where the crowd stood, he could have been carved from stone. This wasn't his first encounter with public mockery. Probably wouldn't be his last. The uniform came with a target painted on your back, and the scars just made it bigger. Imagine having to stand there all day, knowing everyone's looking at you like that, Rosie said, holding up her phone to record. Poor bastard probably wishes he'd died instead of ending up like that. More laughter rippled through the small group that had gathered around them. Someone mentioned Halloween. Someone else made a joke about horror films and makeup effects. The kind of casual cruelty that spreads through crowds like wildfire, each person thinking they're just adding a bit of harmless fun to someone else's suffering. But not everyone was laughing. Further back, Gerald Whitlow, 71, sat with grey hair buzzed military short, despite 2 decades in civilian clothes. His posture was unconsciously perfect, shoulders back, spine straight, hands clasped behind his back. Whitlow had been Royal Engineers, 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, 1 in a place that still didn't appear on maps. Now he came to the palace most mornings for the quiet, for the reminder that some things still mattered. He was watching Harrow with intensity. Something about the way the guardsman held himself. Something about the scars, not just their presence, but their pattern. Burns like that came from explosions, from fuel fires that burned hot enough to melt metal. Whitlow had seen burns like that before, in field hospitals, where the smell of antiseptic couldn't quite cover the smell of charred flesh. In the quiet wards where they sent the ones who lived but would never look the same again. In the faces of men who'd pulled others from burning vehicles while their own faces caught fire. The crowd grew larger. More phones appeared, more comments. Callum had found his audience, each joke crueler than the last. Someone suggested taking a selfie with Freddy Krueger. Someone else wondered if the army had a return policy. The laughter that followed had an edge now. What had started as nervous mockery was becoming something harder, more deliberately cruel. And through it all, Harrow stood there, still as stone, patient as the Thames, taking every word like incoming fire, something to be endured, not responded to. His training had taught him to stand, regardless of weather, regardless of provocation, regardless of anything short of a direct physical threat. Mockery didn't qualify, neither did cruelty. But Gerald Whitlow was getting angry. He watched the crowd grow bolder, watched individual voices join into a chorus of casual viciousness, and felt something old and familiar rising in his chest. The same protective fury he'd felt when green recruits were hazed beyond reason, when good soldiers were treated like expendable equipment, when the system failed the people who served it best. That's when Harrow's sleeve shifted. Just for a moment, as he adjusted his grip on the rifle during a subtle position change, the white cotton pulled back from his wrist. The black ink was visible for maybe 3 seconds. Not long enough for the crowd to notice. Not long enough for Callum to add it to his routine. But long enough for Gerald Whitlow to see it clearly, sabre 2-4. The numbers hit him like a physical blow, followed immediately by recognition of the symbol beneath them. A stylized dagger crossed with lightning bolts, the unofficial insignia of the Special Reconnaissance Regiment's most elite route clearance unit. The men who walked point through IED fields when even the regular special forces thought the risk was too high. Whitlow's hands tightened on the bench until his knuckles went white. His breath caught in his throat, like he'd been punched in the solar plexus. Because he knew what sabre 2-4 meant. He knew what those men had done in Afghanistan, and he knew why so few of them had made it home with all their pieces intact. His nephew James had written to him about sabre 2-4. Long letters full of admiration and terror, describing men who seemed to have a supernatural ability to find improvised explosives before they found their targets. Men who could read the landscape like a book written in death and betrayal. Men who walked into hell on a daily basis so that others could follow safely behind. James had called them legends, ghosts, the kind of soldiers that other soldiers told stories about in the dark hours before dawn. And now one of them was standing 50 feet away, taking abuse from tourists who wouldn't last 5 minutes in the world he'd come from. Whitlow stood slowly, moving through the crowd with purposeful stride. The crowd parted without really noticing him, just another pensioner with somewhere to be. But Whitlow wasn't heading for the tube. He was heading for the rope barrier, and for the guardsman who stood beyond it like a scarred sentinel. Behind him, Callum was still performing, still getting laughs, still making jokes about fire and faces. But Gerald Whitlow wasn't listening anymore. The crowd parted without really noticing him. Just another pensioner with somewhere to be. But Whitlow wasn't heading for the tube or the bus stop. He was heading for the rope barrier, and for the guardsman who stood beyond it like a scarred sentinel, enduring mockery with the same stoic patience he'd once used to endure enemy fire. 2 security officers noticed his approach and started moving in his direction, but something about his bearing, the way he carried himself, the set of his shoulders, the unmistakable posture of a man who'd spent his life in uniform, made them hesitate. This wasn't a tourist looking for a photo opportunity. This was something else entirely. Whitlow reached the rope barrier and ducked under it, with the fluid motion of a man who'd spent his life ignoring rules that didn't make sense in the face of larger priorities. The security officers stopped moving, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch and wait. He stopped 3 feet from Harrow, close enough to speak without shouting, far enough away to show respect for the guardsman's position and duty. When he spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable authority of a senior NCO addressing a soldier he respected. 2-4, he said. It wasn't really a question. It was recognition, acknowledgement. The kind of greeting that passed between men who'd served in places that officially didn't exist. Harrow's eyes didn't move from their fixed point ahead, but something shifted in his posture. The slightest relaxation of muscles held too tight for too long. The recognition of a voice that spoke his language, understood his world. "Yes, sir," he said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough to reach Whitlow's ears. The simple acknowledgement hung in the air between them like smoke from a signal fire. Whitlow nodded once, a sharp military gesture that carried 20 years of shared understanding and mutual respect. "Route clearance," Whitlow said, making it a statement rather than a question. "Helmand Province, forward reconnaissance." "Forward reconnaissance," Harrow confirmed, his voice barely above a whisper. Behind them, the crowd was still laughing. Callum was in the middle of another joke, something about melted wax and special effects makeup. But the 2 men by the sentry box weren't listening anymore. They were somewhere else entirely. Somewhere hot and dusty, and full of the kind of silence that meant death was close and getting closer. "My nephew wrote to me about your unit," Whitlow said, his voice thick with memory. "Corporal James Whitlow, attached to Sabre 2-2 for his final deployment. He said you were legends. Said you could find death in the ground before it found you." Harrow's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Names had power in his world. The power to bring back faces, voices, moments that he'd tried for 15 years to forget. "James Whitlow," he said quietly. "Good soldier, solid under pressure." "He didn't make it home," Whitlow said, and the words carried the weight of a father's grief, an uncle's pride, a nation's debt. "No, sir, he didn't. Should have, though. Should have been me instead." "How many of you made it back?" Whitlow asked, though he was afraid of the answer. Harrow was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of names he'd carried for 15 years, like stones in his pockets. 3 out of 12, sir, and one of those lost both legs to a mine we missed." Whitlow closed his eyes briefly. He'd known the numbers would be bad. Units like Sabre 2-4 didn't exist to come home intact. They existed to make sure others could. To walk into hell first, so that the men behind them might have a chance of walking out again. "And the scars?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Vehicle-borne IED," Harrow said, his voice clinical, factual. "Fuel fire. Got 2 men out before the ammunition cooked off. Didn't get clear fast enough myself." The words were delivered without emotion, but Whitlow could hear the weight behind them. Could see in his mind's eye a younger version of this man dragging burning soldiers from a twisted wreck while his own face caught fire. Could imagine the choice, save himself or save his mates, and the decision that had left him scarred but alive while others died whole. Behind them, Callum's voice rose above the crowd noise, sharp and ugly in the morning air. "I mean, honestly, how do you even look at yourself in the mirror? Must be like shaving a melted candle every morning." The laughter that followed was sharp and cruel, cutting through the morning air like broken glass. That's when Gerald Whitlow turned around. He moved with the deliberate speed of a man who'd made a decision and wouldn't be talked out of it. The crowd saw him coming, an old man with fury in his eyes and 40 years of military bearing in his step, and conversations began to falter. "You?" he said, pointing directly at Callum with the kind of precision that came from years of identifying targets under pressure. "The one with the mouth." Callum blinked, his smile faltering slightly as he realised he'd suddenly become the centre of attention in a way he hadn't expected. "Sorry, what?" "You think this is funny?" Whitlow asked, his voice cutting through the morning air like a drill sergeant's command. "Making jokes about his face? Taking pictures of his scars?" Rosie tugged at Callum's sleeve, suddenly uncomfortable. "Come on, let's just go. This is getting weird." But Callum had an audience now, and he wasn't about to back down in front of them. Male pride and social media bravado combined into something stupider than either alone. "It's just a bit of fun, mate. No harm done. He can't hear us anyway." "No harm done," Whitlow repeated, and there was something in his voice that made the nearby conversation stop, made people turn to look, made the morning air feel suddenly heavier. "You want to know what harm looks like?" He gestured toward Harrow, who stood motionless at his post, still staring straight ahead with the discipline of a man who'd learned to endure worse things than words. "That man walked point through IED fields in Afghanistan. Do you know what that means?" Callum shrugged, but his voice had lost some of its swagger. "Not really, no." "It means he went first," Whitlow said, his voice rising slightly, carrying across the plaza with the authority of a man who'd spent his life speaking truth to people who didn't want to hear it. "When they needed someone to walk down a road that might be mined, he went first. When they needed someone to check if a building was booby-trapped, he went first. When they needed someone to draw enemy fire so others could advance, he went first." The crowd was listening now. Phones were being lowered. Conversations were stopping. Even the pigeons seemed to sense that something important was happening. "Those scars," Whitlow continued, his voice carrying with the kind of moral authority that comes from having buried friends and carried wounded comrades. He got them pulling 2 burning soldiers out of a truck that had been hit by a roadside bomb. Saved their lives while his own face caught fire. Stayed in the flames until he was sure they were clear. Callum's girlfriend was already moving away, embarrassed and wanting distance from whatever this was becoming. But Callum himself stood his ground, though his voice had shrunk considerably. "Look, I didn't know, all right? How was I supposed to know he was some kind of war hero?" "You weren't supposed to know," Whitlow said, stepping closer, his voice dropping to something more dangerous than shouting. "But you were supposed to show basic human decency. Instead, you stood there making entertainment out of someone else's sacrifice." He turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet plaza with the weight of absolute moral certainty. "All of you, standing there laughing at scars, taking pictures of damage, making jokes about pain you can't even imagine." A woman near the back called out, her voice defensive. We didn't know he was a veteran. Would it have mattered? Whitlow shot back, his eyes blazing with righteous anger. Would you have stopped laughing if he'd been burned in a house fire instead of a war? Would his pain have been less worth mocking? Would his humanity have been more obvious? The silence that followed was complete. Even the background noise of London traffic seemed to fade. Even the pigeons had stopped their constant murmuring. Whitlow walked closer to the rope barrier, close enough to speak directly to Harrow without shouting, but still addressing the crowd that had gathered around them. "I knew your unit," he said clearly, his voice carrying across the plaza with the weight of historical truth. "Royal Engineers attached to Special Reconnaissance Regiment, counter-IED operations, route clearance specialists." For the first time, Harrow's eyes moved, just slightly, just enough to acknowledge that he was listening, that he recognized the accuracy of Whitlow's knowledge. "Sabre 2-4 held the northern approach to FOB Wellington for 3 months, Whitlow continued, his voice thick with memory and pride. "Cleared more improvised explosives than any other unit in theatre, lost more men than any other unit in theatre. Had a casualty rate that would have broken any other outfit, but they kept going back out because someone had to." He paused, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. "My nephew was Sabre 2-2, attached to your unit for his final deployment, Corporal James Whitlow. He wrote to me about you, about all of you." Harrow's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and something passed across his scarred features, not quite pain, but recognition of a name that carried weight. "Said you were the best route clearance specialist he'd ever seen," Whitlow continued. "Said you had instincts that kept people alive. Said you could read the ground like a book, see death hiding in the dirt before it saw you. Said if anyone was going to make it home from that hell, it would be you." "He didn't make it home," Harrow said quietly, his voice barely audible but carrying across the silent plaza like a confession. "No," Whitlow agreed, his voice heavy with grief that had never quite healed. "He didn't, but you did. And James would want you to know that every day you're still standing here, still serving, still doing your duty. It's a victory, not just for you, but for all of them who didn't make it back." The crowd was completely silent now. Some people were crying, quiet tears that they wiped away quickly, embarrassed by their own emotion. Others just stood with their heads bowed, suddenly understanding the weight of what they were looking at. Callum had melted back into the crowd, his performance forgotten, his phone put away, his face pale with something that might have been shame. Whitlow reached into his jacket and pulled out something small, a photograph, creased and faded from years of being carried in a wallet. He held it up for Harrow to see, though the crowd couldn't make out the details. "Taken at FOB Wellington," he said, his voice soft now, intimate. "James is third from the left, next to the man with the big smile and the Leeds United shirt." Harrow's eyes moved to the photograph, and for just a moment his composure cracked. The stone mask slipped, and underneath was a man carrying 15 years of survivor's guilt, 15 years of wondering why he'd made it home when better men hadn't. "I remember him," Harrow said, his voice barely audible. "Good soldier, steady hands, should have made it home instead of me." "Oh," Whitlow said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd made peace with grief. "He should have made it home with you. But that's not how war works. That's not how any of this works. The best don't always survive. The deserving don't always get what they've earned. Sometimes good men die and damaged men live, and we have to find a way to make that mean something." He folded the photograph carefully and put it back in his pocket, next to his heart. "But you're here, you're still serving, still standing guard over things that matter, and that means more than you know." From somewhere in the crowd, a voice called out, "I'm sorry." Then another. Then several more, not forced apologies, but genuine recognition of something they'd failed to see, failed to understand. Harrow didn't acknowledge them, didn't turn to accept their apologies or bask in their newfound respect. He simply resumed his position, rifle steady, eyes forward, doing the job he'd been trained to do with the same precision and dedication he'd shown for 20 years. But something had changed. The crowd stood differently now, quieter, more aware of what they were looking at, more conscious of the weight carried by the men who stood still so that others could move freely. Whitlow stepped back from the rope barrier and straightened his jacket. The morning had taken on a different quality, heavier, more significant. The light seemed different. The air itself seemed to carry more weight. "Carry on, guardsman," he said formally, giving Harrow the respect he deserved. "Sir," Harrow replied, and in that single word was acknowledgement, gratitude, and the continuing bond between men who'd served something larger than themselves. And then, as if nothing had happened, the routine resumed. The crowd began to move again. Conversations started up, but they were different now, quieter, more respectful. The laughter was gone. The jokes had stopped. The phones were put away. The security officers who had started moving toward Whitlow earlier now stood back respectfully. One of them, a young sergeant with military bearing of his own, approached the veteran as he prepared to leave. "That was well done, sir," he said quietly, his voice carrying the respect of one professional for another. Whitlow nodded, suddenly feeling his age. Long overdue. As the crowd began to thin out, a few individuals lingered. An elderly woman left a small poppy near Harrow's post. A veteran, in a worn regimental blazer, gave a subtle salute as he passed. A young man approached Whitlow as he prepared to leave. "Sir, I was laughing earlier, before I understood. Is there anything I can do?" Whitlow studied the boy's face, seeing genuine regret. "Remember," he said simply, "remember that everyone carries something you can't see. Remember that scars are evidence of survival. And remember that respect doesn't cost anything, but its absence costs everything." The boy nodded seriously and walked back toward the barrier, standing quietly now, watching Harrow with something approaching reverence. But mostly people just watched, quietly, respectfully, understanding, finally, what they were looking at. The ceremony continued around them, unchanged and unchanging. The guards marched their prescribed routes with clockwork precision. The palace carried on its ancient business. The tourists took their pictures and bought their souvenirs. But something fundamental had shifted. In the space of 20 minutes, Nathaniel Harrow had gone from being a target of mockery to being seen for what he really was. A man who had given everything he could give and was still giving more. Gerald Whitlow remained by the bench for another hour, watching the crowd, watching the guards, remembering his nephew and all the others who hadn't made it home. When he finally left, he walked past Harrow's post one more time. "James would be proud," he said quietly, just loud enough for the guardsman to hear. "They all would be." Harrow didn't respond verbally, but Whitlow saw the slightest nod of acknowledgement, saw the way the guardsman's shoulders straightened just a fraction, saw the way 15 years of carrying guilt seemed to lift just slightly. As the afternoon shift prepared to take over, Harrow maintained his position until the final moment. When relief arrived, a younger guardsman, with an unmarked face and eyes that hadn't seen what Harrow's had seen, he stepped back with the same precision he'd shown all day, saluted his replacement with military exactness, and began the walk back to Wellington Barracks. The crowd watched him go. No one laughed. No one made jokes about his scars or his bearing, or the way he moved with the careful precision of a man who'd learned that every step might be his last. They watched with something approaching reverence, finally understanding what they'd been looking at all along. Because now they knew, now they understood that the man walking away from them had once walked into hell so others wouldn't have to, had paid the price for his service in scars and silence and survivor's guilt, but had never stopped serving, had never stopped standing guard over the things that mattered. And in the fading London afternoon, with grey clouds still hanging low over the city and the eternal dampness of October settling into everyone's bones, that seemed like something worth respecting, something worth remembering, something worth honouring with the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. Have you ever judged someone by their scars before knowing their story? Have you ever seen courage hiding behind damage? Strength wearing the mask of survival? Share this with someone who needs to understand that heroes don't always look like the movies taught us they should. That sometimes the strongest people are the ones who bear their wounds openly, who stand guard despite their pain, who serve something larger than themselves even when the world doesn't recognize their sacrifice. Hit that subscribe button if you believe that respect is something we owe each other, not something we earn through perfection. And ring the notification bell so you never miss a story that matters. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and whether you've ever seen quiet courage that went unrecognized. Whether you've ever witnessed the moment when understanding replaced judgment, when respect replaced mockery. More stories are waiting for you on the screen right now. Stories of people who served, who sacrificed, who stood firm when everything around them was falling apart. Choose one, and we'll see you tomorrow.